U.S. military and intelligence officials fear that there's a good chance that this Persian Gulf region could explode within a matter of months. And as you know, it's all about Iran's nuclear program. Because of tougher U.S. sanctions, Iran has already threatened to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, that vital passageway for much of the world's oil. And if Israel launches airstrikes against Iran's nuclear program, Iranian leaders have threatened all-out war. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet would be the world's first line of defense. And its commander, Vice Admiral Mark Fox, said today they're prepared to take on just about anything Iran throws at them.
This is the world we live in. What if it happened tonight? What would we do? We're prepared today.
U.S. officials warn, however, that Iran's massive stockpile of ballistic missiles is the more serious threat. And within just the past few days, Iranian leaders have threatened that if attacked, they would launch those missiles at U.S. targets in this region.
The international community is all concerned about the prospect of a new nuclear weapons power in an already very volatile region.
There are issues that people see as a national right, and to be told then that folks around you can have nuclear weapons, but you can't.
I do believe there's some legitimate concerns about Iran's nuclear program, but the way to go about it is a kind of law-based, universal-based disarmament agenda, not this kind of nuclear apartheid.
There is a tremendous amount of suspicions about the Iranian nuclear program and a lot of question marks that the international community, at least the IAEA and several Western states, believe that Iran has not answered. The bottom line is, regardless of how you assess the evidence for or against Iran here, bottom line is that in the absence of greater transparency and some sort of a deal that would give the IAEA far greater insight into what the Iranians are doing, there wouldn't be a comfort level outside of Iran, particularly in the West, in regards to the Iranian nuclear program. And that absence of a comfort level can be quite problematic and can lead to a war.
But what is happening is that the Israeli government, the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu, is manipulating the political forces in the United States, and I must say also manipulating the International Atomic Energy Agency, creating reports, particularly last November, which then become the fodder for the news media in the United States to carry out what I would refer to as yellow journalism, sort of hyping the alleged threat from Iran as reflected in those reports, the threat of an Iranian testing of a nuclear weapon, particularly as a sign that the Iranians are determined to go for nuclear weapons.
And people are reluctant to criticize some issues of the Israeli government, particularly when the claim is, oh, the Iranian government is going to kill all the Jews. Well, that's an issue that strikes very close to the heart, given the Holocaust and many other attacks throughout history against Jews. The problem, of course, is it's a phony argument. It doesn't exist. If Iran was such an existential threat to Israel and to the Jewish people, why hasn't it already launched a conventional weapons attack on Israel? It has the planes, it has the missiles, it could cause a lot of damage with conventional weapons. It doesn't do it because A, it doesn't want to, that's not its intention, and B, it would be eliminated as a country because Israel and the United States would immediately bomb the heck out of them, would destroy the government and overthrow it. So the people who run the Iranian government are not mad mullahs, they're not crazy, they're rational people whose policies I strongly disagree with, but who have a very keen sense of wanting to survive. And so by over-exaggerating the threat and touching issues very close to Jewish being, the Israeli government has a certain level of support among American Jews and a great deal of criticism as well.
And then you have the Congress, both the Senate and the House, who were clearly instruments of Israeli influence in the period of November, December of last year, when the Israeli lobby was pushing for new sanctions aimed at depriving Iran of the export of crude oil. And that was a proposal which the Obama administration opposed very strenuously, arguing, I think quite correctly, that the likely result would be to create a spike in world oil prices. And that, of course, would have a very detrimental effect not only in the world economy, but on the U.S. economy as well. Nevertheless, the Senate voted 100-0 to support that legislation to carry out sanctions against the Iranian crude oil sector, as well as the National Bank of Iran. Then the House of Representatives followed suit and passed similar legislation, and that's why we have the oil sanctions against Iran now in place, which are to go into effect in mid-year 2012. That is a sign of the most advanced power that any foreign government, I think, has ever had on the U.S. political system with regard to the question of going to war against a foreign government. And so I think what that reflects is that, particularly in an election year, President Obama is still very vulnerable to the pressures coming from the Republican Party and from the right wing in general in the United States, which of course dispose of great power over the news media and can control to a great extent the narrative that is coming out of Washington, D.C. and from the world in general. And therefore, I think we have to anticipate that President Obama is going to handle this question of policy toward Iran very carefully with kid gloves. He will be very reluctant to make statements that indicate a willingness to compromise with Iran to reach an agreement, and that may well hamper the ability of the United States to negotiate the settlement, the agreement that is really needed in this situation.
A nuclear-armed Iran would ignite a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. It would give terrorists a nuclear umbrella. It would make the nightmare of nuclear terrorism a clear and present danger throughout the world. I want you to understand what this means, because if we don't stop it, it's coming. They could put a bomb anywhere. They could put it in a missile. They're working on missiles that could reach this city. They could put it on a ship inside a container, could reach every port. They could eventually put it in a suitcase or in a subway. Now, the threat to my country cannot be overstated. Those who dismiss it are sticking their heads in the sand. Less than 7 decades after 6 million Jews were murdered, Iran's leaders deny the Holocaust of the Jewish people while calling for the annihilation of the Jewish state. Leaders who spew such venom should be banned from every respectable forum on the planet. But there's something that makes the outrage even greater. You know what that is? It's the lack of outrage. Because in much of the international community, the calls for our destruction are met with utter silence. It's even worse, because there are many who rush to condemn Israel for defending itself against Iran's terror proxies. Not you. Not America. You've acted differently. You've condemned the Iranian regime for its genocidal aims. You've passed tough sanctions against Iran. History will salute you, America.
President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu are in virtual agreement about the legitimacy of a first strike against Iran, a preemptive strike, without any further provocation besides Iran potentially building a nuclear weapon. And this is a fundamental change for Obama and for the United States. The first time that we engaged in preemptive attack was in Iraq under President Bush, and Obama became famous and a major candidate against Hillary Clinton precisely on the grounds that Obama opposed preemptive strikes and made that a central issue in the nomination struggle for the Democratic nomination for president in 2008. Now he's completely reversed himself and is in alignment with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
I don't think there is any real support for preventive war in international law. There is some support for anticipatory military action, meaning that if there's a very imminent attack coming from the other side, that there would be legal basis for taking anticipatory military action. But we're not even anywhere close to that because the Iranians don't have a nuclear weapon. They don't have a delivery system either. So to try to use the existing international law of anticipatory military action simply is not valid. It doesn't fit what the law actually says. So both on that issue as well on the issue of trying to prevent Iranians from having nuclear enrichment, the difficulties that the United States has run into that is that international law is not on its side, and it's created greater ease for the Iranians to get international sympathy and undermine the administration's ability to create a very strong international coalition against it.
The United Nations Charter, which is the primary treaty in the world, and the United States has ratified the UN Charter, forbids countries from invading other countries unless they are acting either in self-defense or the Security Council gives its blessing. Now, Obama has said, largely in response to pressure from Israel, which views Iran as a threat, that Obama will act to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. This goes beyond the containment policy that the United States pursued during the Cold War when the Soviet Union had unknown numbers of proven nuclear weapons.
I think the primary concern that the Israelis are having is not necessarily that Iran would get a nuclear weapon and use it, but that in the process of the Iranians getting a weapon or getting a capability, the United States and Iran would negotiate, some form of deal would be found, and that deal would be acceptable and would reduce US-Iran tensions, but would not necessarily reduce Israeli-Iranian tensions. And as a result, Israel would feel abandoned, facing a hostile Iran more alone than it currently is. Moreover, an Iran that has a nuclear capability would, in the Israeli perspective, shift the balance of power, reduce Israel's maneuverability in a manner that the Israelis obviously don't like to see. Now, does all of this amount to an existential threat? In my assessment, it doesn't. And in my assessment, the Israeli leaders actually don't believe Iran is an existential threat. But heightening the rhetoric and the hysteria around this question to an existential debate has been calculated in Israel to be a useful political tool in order to pressure the United States to take far more hawkish positions and measures against the Iranian nuclear program.
Realistically, I can't see a scenario where Iran will launch a suicidal nuclear strike against Israel or anybody else. Presumably, if they do want to consider a nuclear weapons option, they are doing it for the same reason any other country has developed nuclear weapons. They see it as a deterrent against possible aggression. And when you see how their neighbors to their immediate east and west have been invaded by the United States, and when Iraq they were invaded and occupied, you kind of understand why they might want that kind of deterrent.
The cost to Israel of an unprovoked attack against Iran would be frightful. It would be as the former Mossad chief Meir Dagan has said publicly, it could be the end of Israel as a state. The reason being that Iran has the ability, in retaliation against a strike against Iran, to launch Shahab-3 missiles. It has apparently as many as 300 such missiles in its inventory. And once it launches those missiles, each of the missiles has 5 warheads, independently targeted warheads, which can be maneuvered so that they can strike a different target in Israel. That means that if only a small percentage of the Shahab-3 missiles that are launched in retaliation actually get through the Israeli anti-missile defense system, that would mean dozens of Israeli targets, obviously mostly cities, mostly urban areas of Israel, would be hit. And that means that there would be thousands of Israeli casualties killed, tens of thousands wounded, as the most likely scenario in any aftermath of an Israeli attack. That means that an Israeli attack is essentially an irrational policy to pursue. But that does not mean, I think, that we can be assured that it would not happen.
So we know that Iran's going to come up with some ways to respond. What they'll almost certainly do is figure out how to cut off oil supplies and raise the price of oil, because that will very likely create a very significant global economic crisis that will be felt even in the United States.
If there is an actual physical war, then the price of oil will go above $200, most likely between $200 to $250 to $300 per barrel, if not higher. Particularly if Iran can manage to close the Strait of Hormuz, which shouldn't be difficult to close it. The Iranians will have a problem keeping it closed, but as long as, even if they can manage to close it for 1 or 2 days, the world would perceive their reclosing it as a real possibility, and that would put huge pressure on the price of oil. And of course, as we know, a hike in the price of oil of that magnitude, where the price is tripled, for example, would cause the world economy to collapse.
So we have this irrational situation where Israel is, at least the prime ministers of the political office, is really drumming up the war drums for attacking Iran. And we know from military analysts, from intelligence analysts, overwhelming in the United States, and to a significant degree in Israel, that at best this will buy a little bit of time, but also likely increase Iran's resolve to actually develop nuclear weapons. So we know that this would be a very bad idea, not to mention that would be a bad idea for the global economy and certainly for instability in the Middle East. But somehow we're stuck in this situation, both Israel and the United States, of being very dependent on a huge military industrial sector and dependent on having an enemy to warn about. And in this case, we make it a very irrational solution that could be a danger to the global order.
But there's a big difference between justifying your Pentagon budget and actually going to war against a foe like Iran. The reason being that Iran can strike back. I think that the feeling was that Saddam Hussein's Iraq did not have the capability to strike against the United States, and therefore during the Bush administration was viewed as a foe that we could afford to carry out an aggressive war against. That's not the case against Iran, because Iran can hit U.S. forces in the region, both naval and army ground forces in the Middle East, and cause a great deal of damage, which the U.S. military, I don't think, believes is worth a war against Iran.
There is much discord, debate going on within the Iranian government as we speak. We've all seen what happened in the 2009 elections, the current elections. There's an obvious internal power struggle going on between the Ayatollah and Ahmadinejad, and how the Revolutionary Guard fits into this, no one's quite sure. So there are various foci of power, and it's not clear whether among those various power groups within Iran, certainly there is disagreement as to whether they should in fact develop nuclear weapons. So an actual attack might draw all of them to the conclusion that just redoubling their efforts, that the only way that they're going to have security is to, in fact, as North Korea does, have nuclear weapons capability.
Well, I think in the assessment of most military analysts, even if there is a massive American military campaign against the Iranian nuclear facilities, the likelihood of actually being able to prevent the Iranians in the long run from getting nuclear weapons would not be achieved. At best, it could set back the program a few short years.
I think there's a consensus in Washington that includes moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans all the way over to the right wing of both parties that says Iran is an enemy, and therefore we have to do something to overthrow their government. And the pressuring them economically by crippling sanctions or bombing them militarily will result in regime change. The differences are one of tactics. The far right wing, the moneyed interests backing the very, very conservative forces in Israel and the United States, they favor a military strike. The other folks favor crippling sanctions. You know, they've just most recently prevented Iranian banks from using the international banking system that allows banks to transfer money back and forth. And so Iran has been very badly hit by that, among other sanctions. The U.S. has never used that against any other country in the world, including Iraq and other countries that we're formerly at war with.
I think we should pursue the policies that we're actually engaged in. The sanctions, even though everyone knows sanctions cannot force anybody to do anything, but they do seem to be having an impact. And this idea that the Iranians are finally coming, at least nominally coming back to the negotiating table in this other forum, I think is a very positive, positive event, positive movement forward.
President Obama has taken some great steps towards seeming open in relation to negotiations with Iran, but I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in the United States in preventing a war with Iran is to convince our policymakers, convince President Obama that sanctions are not diplomacy, and that sanctions in fact pave the road for a war the same way that they did in Iraq, and they harm the ordinary people inside Iran, the same people that Mr. Obama and others have said they would like to reach out to and whose lives they would like to make better.
So this type of sanctions may eventually lead to war. So even if they don't say explicitly that they support war, what they advocate may very well lead to war. And at the same time, a lot of them shed crocodile tears for Iranian people. How can you claim that you support Iranian people while at the same time you are advocating tough economic sanctions that are hurting every ordinary Iranian in his or her daily lives? The sanctions have already affected millions of Iranians. The economy has been in bad shape, and things are deteriorating even worse. So how can anyone advocate economic sanctions on the one hand, and then claim that is concerned about the plight of Iranian people, Iranian people aspirations, and so on? One or both of them are bogus, and in my case, in my opinion, I think that their cries for supporting Iranian people and Iranian people's human rights and Iranian demands for freedom and Iranian people's aspiration is just bogus, is crocodile tears.
I have said that when it comes to preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, I will take no options off the table, and I mean what I say. That includes all elements of American power. A political effort aimed at isolating Iran, a diplomatic effort to sustain our coalition and ensure that the Iranian program is monitored, an economic effort that imposes crippling sanctions, and yes, a military effort to be prepared for any contingency. Iran's leaders should understand that I do not have a policy of containment. I have a policy to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And as I have made clear time and again during the course of my presidency, I will not hesitate to use force when it is necessary to defend the United States and its interests. Moving forward, I would ask that we all remember the weightiness of these issues. The stakes involved for Israel, for America, and for the world. Already there's too much loose talk of war. Over the last few weeks, such talk has only benefited the Iranian government by driving up the price of oil, which they depend on to fund their nuclear program. For the sake of Israel's security, America's security, and the peace and security of the world, now is not the time for bluster. Now's the time to let our increased pressure sink in and to sustain the broad international coalition we have built.